Evening, friend. Come close to the fire tonight. This is a story about two people who had both lost everything and were too stubborn to admit they needed anyone. His name was Caleb Mercer. Hers was Margaret Aldridge. He had 40 acres of land that was slowly turning to dust. She had a bag of money from a dead husband's savings, and the kind of knowledge about livestock that most men spend a lifetime learning. He needed what she had. She needed what he had, and neither one of them wanted to be the first to say it. That is how the best partnerships start, I suppose. Not with trust, but with two people who have run clean out of options. The drought of 1877 was the worst anyone in the valley could remember. It started in June, quiet and slow, the way the worst things always start. The rain just stopped coming. At first, folks figured it was a dry spell. Nothing more. They had seen dry spells before. But June turned into July, and July turned into August, and the sky stayed pale and empty, day after day, like it had forgotten what clouds were for. By September, the creek that ran through Caleb Mercer's property was nothing but a line of cracked mud with a few sad puddles sitting in the low spots. The corn he had planted in the spring had died standing up, brown and brittle, rustling in the hot wind like the pages of a closed book. His cattle were down to 7 head from a herd that had once numbered 30. The rest he had sold, one by one, at prices that made his stomach turn, just to keep feed in the barn and himself upright. Caleb was 34 years old, though the drought had added 10 years to his face. He was a tall man, lean in the way that hard work and not enough food will make a man lean. His hands were rough and cracked, the knuckles swollen from years of fencing, digging, and holding on to things that did not want to be held. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a pale gray-brown that could look warm or cold, depending on his mood. Lately, they had been cold. His wife, Emmeline, had been gone for 2 years. A fever took her in the winter of 1875, fast and merciless. She went to bed with a headache on a Tuesday night and was gone by Thursday morning. Caleb had buried her on the hill behind the house, under the big oak tree where they used to sit on summer evenings and watch the sun go down. He had put a stone there with her name and the words she used to say every morning when she stepped out onto the porch. "This is where we belong." After Emmeline died, Caleb did what men do when the center of their world disappears. He worked. He worked from before the sun came up until long after it went down. He fixed fences that did not need fixing. He repaired the barn roof twice. He plowed fields and planted crops and tended cattle with a grim, relentless energy that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with staying one step ahead of the grief that was always right behind him. The drought took even that away from him. There was only so much a man could do when the land itself was dying. By September, Caleb had stopped pretending. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, a cup of coffee in his hand that he often forgot to drink, and stare at his 40 acres of dust and wonder how much longer he could hold on. She sat on the step and looked out at the dying fields with an expression that Caleb could not quite read. It was not pity. It was something more practical than that, something measured, like a carpenter looking at a broken house and seeing what it would take to fix it. "I know about this ranch," she said. I know it was good land before the drought. I know the creek runs again in wet years, and the soil is deep enough to hold moisture when the rain comes back. I also know that you are 3 months behind on your bank payments, and that Douglas Whitfield at the Cattleman's Bank has been talking about foreclosure. Caleb's jaw tightened. You seem to know a lot for a stranger. I asked around, Margaret said simply. That is what a person does before making an investment. An investment. I would like to buy a half partnership in this ranch, she said. Her voice was calm and direct, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation but was not nervous about it. I have money. I have livestock, 12 head of good breeding cattle that are currently being held at the Pearson Ranch south of here. And I have experience. My late husband and I ran a cattle operation in Kansas for 6 years before he passed. I am sorry for your loss, Caleb said, because his mother had raised him to say things like that even when his mind was somewhere else entirely. And I am sorry for yours, Margaret replied, and the way she said it made him look at her more carefully. There was no performance in it. She said it the way someone says it who knows exactly what those words mean because they have lived inside them. I do not need a partner, Caleb said. Mr. Mercer, with all respect, you need something. Your cattle are half-starved. Your fences are falling down. Your corn is dead in the field. And winter is coming. I am aware of my situation, Mrs. Aldridge. Then you are aware that without help, you will lose this ranch before spring. The silence between them stretched out long and taut. The evening light was turning golden, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, lonesome and thin. Why here? Caleb finally asked. There are 100 ranches in this territory. Why mine? Because yours is the one that can be saved, Margaret said. Most of the others are too far gone, or the owners have already given up. You have not given up. I can see it in the way you keep those fences patched and your porch swept. A man who has given up does not sweep his porch. He had swept them that morning. He did not know why. It just seemed like the thing to do. I need to think about it, he said. Of course, Margaret replied. She stood and brushed the dust from her dress. I will be staying at the boarding house in town. You can send word when you have made your decision. She paused at the gate. Mr. Mercer, I want to be clear about something. I am not offering charity. This would be a business arrangement. I am not looking for a husband, and I am not looking for someone to take care of me. I am looking for a partner, and I believe we could help each other. She climbed back into her wagon and drove away. Caleb sat on the porch until the stars came out, turning her words over in his mind like stones in a creek bed. His pride told him to refuse. His pride had been the loudest voice in his head for 2 years, drowning out everything else, telling him that he did not need anyone, that he could do this alone, that asking for help was the same as admitting defeat. But there was another voice, quieter and more honest, and it sounded a lot like Emmeline. It said, "You stubborn fool, let someone help you." He sent word to the boarding house the next morning. They met at the ranch at noon. Margaret arrived in her wagon again, this time with a leather folder full of papers. She had drawn up a partnership agreement, neatly written in a clear hand, every detail spelled out. Caleb read it carefully. It was fair. More than fair, really. She was putting up the money and the cattle. He was putting up the land. Profits would be split evenly. Either party could dissolve the partnership with 6 months' notice. The land would remain in Caleb's name. You had this drawn up before you came to see me, Caleb said. I had it drawn up before I left Kansas, Margaret corrected him. I knew what I was looking for. I just needed to find the right place. They shook hands on the porch. His grip was rough and tired. Hers was firm and certain. Neither one of them smiled. It was not that kind of deal. The first week was difficult. Margaret moved her cattle onto the property, and with them came a supply of feed she had purchased along the way. She set up a small camp near the barn, sleeping in her wagon despite Caleb's awkward offer of the spare room in the house. That would not be proper, she said, and the subject was closed. They worked side by side, but they did not talk much. Caleb was not a talker by nature, and Margaret seemed to understand that without being told. She went about her work with a quiet efficiency that impressed him. Despite himself, she knew cattle the way he knew land, with an instinct that went beyond books and training. She could look at a cow and tell you what it needed before the animal even knew itself. She checked hooves, examined eyes, felt along ribs and spines with hands that were gentle but sure. On the second morning, Caleb found her in the field at sunrise, walking the property line with a notebook in her hand. She was writing things down, stopping every few yards to examine the soil, the slope of the ground, the direction of the water runoff. He watched her from the porch for a while, his coffee growing cold in his hand. She moved with purpose, like a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what she was looking for. "What are you doing?" he called out. "Mapping the water," she said without looking up. "When the rain comes back, you need to know where it will go. Half your topsoil has been washing into the low field because there is nothing to stop it. If we dig a diversion channel along the east ridge, we can direct the runoff into the creek bed and keep the soil where it belongs." In 2 years of struggling with this land, that solution had never occurred to him. He was a cattleman and a farmer. She was thinking like an engineer. "William taught me," she said, finally looking up. She must have read the surprise on his face. He was not much of a rancher, but he understood. He used to say that anyone can raise cattle, but the person who controls the water controls everything. "Smart man," Caleb said. "He was," Margaret agreed, and went back to her notebook. On the third day, Caleb came out of the house at dawn and found that Margaret had already repaired the broken section of the east fence that he had been meaning to get to for a month. The posts were set straight and deep, the wire pulled tight. The work as clean and solid as anything he could have done himself. She was sitting by a small fire, drinking coffee from a tin cup, as if it was nothing. "You did not have to do that," he said. "It needed doing," she replied. "Coffee?" He took the cup she offered and sat on a rock nearby. The coffee was strong and hot, better than the watery stuff he had been making for himself. They sat in the early morning quiet and watched the sun come up over the mountains, the sky turning from gray to pale gold to a deep, clear blue. A hawk circled overhead, riding the warm air that rose from the valley floor. The cattle were quiet in the field, moving slowly through the dry grass. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb did not feel alone. He did not say that. He was not ready for that. But he felt it. And that was a start. By the end of the second week, they had fallen into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Caleb rose first, lit the stove, and put the coffee on. Margaret was up 10 minutes later, already dressed for work, her hair pinned up and her boots laced tight. They drank their coffee in silence, not the heavy silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who did not need words to share a morning. The weeks passed, and a rhythm formed. Caleb handled the land, the fencing, the water management, the endless daily maintenance that kept a ranch from falling apart. Margaret handled the cattle, the feed, the breeding plans, the careful calculations that would turn 7 half-starved cows and 12 good breeders into a viable herd. They divided the work without discussing it, each recognizing what the other was better at, and stepping back without ego. They ate dinner together most evenings, sitting on the porch because the house felt too intimate for two people who were still strangers. Margaret was a good cook, far better than Caleb, who had been living on beans and cornbread for 2 years. The first time she made a proper stew with biscuits, Caleb ate 3 bowls and then stared at his empty plate as if it had personally betrayed him by running out. "I can make more tomorrow," Margaret said, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile on her face. "That would be fine," Caleb said, which was as close to a compliment as he could manage. The conversations came slowly, the way water comes back to a dry creek. First, just a trickle. Small talk about the weather and the cattle and the price of feed. Then, gradually, deeper things. Margaret told him about Kansas, about the flat, endless prairie, and the wind that never stopped. She told him about her husband, William, a quiet man who was good with numbers and terrible with horses. He had died of a blood infection from a cut that should have healed, but did not. He was a kind man, Margaret said one evening, looking at the sunset with that calm, measured expression she wore like armor. Not exciting, not adventurous, just kind. The sort of man who always asked how your day was and actually listened to the answer. "That sounds like a good man," Caleb said. He was, and he would have hated to see me sitting still, feeling sorry for myself. William believed that life was a series of problems to be solved, not endured. When he died, I sat in our house for 3 months doing nothing. Then one morning I woke up and heard his voice in my head, clear as day. He said, "Margaret, for the love of God, go do something useful." Caleb almost smiled at that. Emmeline used to say something similar. She would say, "Caleb Mercer, if you sit on that porch one more minute, I am going to push you off it." It was the first time he had spoken Emmeline's name to another person since she died. The word felt strange in his mouth, like a key he had not used in a long time. Margaret looked at him, and he saw that she understood exactly what it had cost him to say it. "Tell me about her," Margaret said softly. And he did, sitting on the porch in the fading light, with the cattle settling in the field and the first stars appearing overhead. Caleb told Margaret about Emmeline, how they had met at a church social in Missouri, how she had laughed at his terrible dancing and then taught him how to do it right, how she had agreed to marry him and move west without a moment's hesitation because she believed that adventure was worth more than safety. How she had painted the shutters of this house blue because it reminded her of the sky over the river where she grew up. He talked for almost an hour. Margaret listened without interrupting, without offering comfort or advice, just listening the way William used to listen, with her full attention and nothing else. When he finished, the stars were out in full, and the night was cool. "Thank you," Margaret said. "For what? For trusting me with that?" He looked at her in the starlight and realized that something had shifted between them. It was not romance, not yet, nothing as simple or as frightening as that. It was something quieter. Recognition. The recognition that comes when you meet someone who has walked through the same fire you have and come out the other side still standing. October arrived, and with it came the first signs that the drought might be breaking. The air smelled different, heavier, carrying the faint promise of moisture. The clouds that appeared on the western horizon were thicker than they had been all summer, darker, more purposeful. "Rain is coming," Margaret said one morning, looking at the sky with her practical eye. "Do not jinx it," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I am not the jinxing type. I have noticed the rain came 3 days later, not the gentle soaking rain that the land needed, but a violent thunderstorm that rolled in from the mountains like a freight train. The sky turned black at noon. Lightning cracked across the valley in jagged white lines, and the wind, which had been still for months, came back with a vengeance. Caleb was in the house when he heard it, a sound like a giant hand slapping the earth. He ran to the porch and saw the barn roof peeling away in the wind, shingles flying like playing cards. The cattle were panicking, running in blind circles in the corral. Margaret was already there. She had come running from her wagon, her hair loose and wild in the wind, her dress soaked through. She was at the corral gate, trying to open it before the cattle crushed themselves against the fence. "The gate is jammed," she shouted over the storm. Caleb was beside her in an instant. Together they pulled at the gate, the rain hammering them, the wind trying to knock them off their feet. The metal latch had bent in the heat of summer and would not give. Caleb grabbed a fence post and used it as a lever. The latch snapped. The gate swung open. The cattle poured out into the open field, spreading out and calming as the pressure of the corral released. But the barn was still coming apart. A beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, and half the east wall buckled inward. Inside were the feed stores, the tools, and Margaret's saddle, the one thing she had kept from her life with William. She started toward the barn. "Margaret? No," Caleb shouted. She did not stop. She ducked under the sagging door frame and disappeared inside. Caleb swore under his breath and went in after her. The interior was a chaos of wind and rain and falling debris. He found her pulling sacks of feed away from the collapsing wall, stacking them near the door where they might survive. "Leave it," he yelled. "It is not worth your life." "It is worth the winter," she yelled back. And she was right. Without that feed, the cattle would not make it to spring. They worked together in the wreckage of the barn, passing sacks of grain and bundles of hay through the broken doorway, ducking as beams groaned and timbers fell around them. At one point, a rafter came down and Caleb shoved Margaret out of the way, taking a glancing blow to his shoulder that sent a shock of pain down his arm. She looked at him with wide eyes, rain streaming down her face. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Keep moving," he said. They saved most of the feed. They saved the tools. And Margaret saved William's saddle. Clutching it against her chest as they stumbled out of the barn just before the rest of the east wall gave way with a groan of tortured wood and a crash that shook the ground beneath their feet, they stood in the rain, side by side, watching the barn collapse. They were soaked to the bone, covered in dust and splinters, breathing hard. Caleb's shoulder was throbbing. Margaret's hands were bleeding from a nail she had caught on the doorframe. The feed sacks were piled behind them, muddy but intact. The tools were scattered in the yard, and William's saddle was clutched against Margaret's chest, the leather dark with rain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The destruction of the barn should have felt like the final blow, the thing that broke them. But standing there in the wreckage, with the rain coming down and the cattle safe in the open field, Caleb felt something unexpected. He felt strong, not because the barn was gone, but because they had gone into it together and come out the other side. He looked at Margaret. Her hair had come loose from its pins and was hanging in wet strands around her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. There was a streak of mud across her cheek and sawdust in her eyebrows. She looked nothing like the composed, practical woman who had stepped down from a wagon 2 months ago with a business proposal and a leather folder. She looked like someone who would run into a collapsing barn to save the feed that would keep the cattle alive through winter. She looked like someone he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. And then the rain changed. The violent, angry sheets of water softened into something gentler, steadier, the kind of rain that soaks into the ground instead of running off it, the kind of rain that the land had been dying for, the kind of rain that means the drought is over. Margaret looked up at the sky and closed her eyes. The rain ran down her face, and she let it, standing there with her arms at her sides and her palms turned upward, as if she were receiving something she had been waiting for. Caleb watched her, and in that moment, standing in the wreckage of his barn with the saving rain falling all around them, he understood something that had been growing in him for weeks, quiet and stubborn, like a seed pushing through dry earth. He did not just need her. He wanted her there, not as a business partner, not as a convenience, as someone who belonged on this land, in this life, beside him. He did not say it. He was not ready yet. Some things need time to find their words. They spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding the barn. The whole town came to help, or at least most of it did. In small communities like theirs, a barn raising was an event, part work and part celebration. The word went out on a Monday, and by Wednesday morning, there were 12 men and their families at the Mercer Ranch. Wagons lined up along the fence, horses tied to every post. Neighbors brought lumber and nails and their strong backs. Tom Driscoll, who ran the hardware store, donated a barrel of nails and refused payment. "Consider it an investment in the valley," he said, tipping his hat to Margaret. The Pearson family, who had been keeping Margaret's cattle before she moved them, brought a full team of horses to drag the heavy beams into place. Even the preacher came, though he was better at encouragement than carpentry. The women brought food, enough to feed an army. There were pots of stew and platters of biscuits and 3 different kinds of pie. Mrs. Driscoll set up a table under the big cottonwood tree and ran the food operation with the efficiency of a military commander. The children ran around underfoot, getting in the way and being useful in equal measure. A boy named Peter figured out how to carry nails in his hat, which everyone agreed was the innovation of the day. Old Joe Tanner, who had been building barns since before the war, took charge of the construction. He was a wiry man of 60, with a voice like a rusty gate and an opinion on everything. He directed the work with a stream of instructions, corrections, and commentary that never paused for breath. He looked at Caleb and Margaret working side by side, passing boards and hammering nails in an easy rhythm that spoke of weeks of partnership, and he said to his wife, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Those two are going to figure it out eventually." "Hush, Joe," his wife said. "I am just stating a fact. A man does not look at a business partner the way Caleb Mercer looks at that woman, Joseph Tanner. If you do not close your mouth, I will close it for you." Joe hushed, but he was not wrong, and everyone there knew it. The town had been talking, of course. A single man and a single woman living on the same property, even with the propriety of separate quarters and a business agreement, was enough to fuel the gossip mill for months. Most of it was good-natured. Margaret had won people over quickly with her competence and her directness. She was not a woman who played games or put on airs. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and in a frontier town, that counted for a great deal. But not everyone was kind. Caleb's former mother-in-law, Edith Hartley, had taken the partnership as a personal affront. Edith was a stout, sharp-tongued woman who had adored her daughter and transferred that fierce, protective love to her daughter's memory. In Edith's mind, any woman on Caleb's property was an insult to Emmeline. She came to the ranch one afternoon while Margaret was out checking on the cattle. She sat in the parlor, her back straight as a fence post, and told Caleb exactly what she thought. "That woman is after your land," Edith said. "She is a stranger. Nobody knows where she truly comes from or what her intentions are. And you are letting her waltz in here and take over the ranch that my Emmeline built with her own 2 hands." "Emmeline would have liked her," Caleb said quietly. Edith recoiled as if he had slapped her. "How dare you presume to know what my daughter would have thought?" "Because I knew her better than anyone," Caleb said, his voice still quiet, but firm in a way it had not been before Margaret arrived. "And Emmeline was the most practical woman I ever met. She would have looked at this situation and said, 'Caleb, stop being a fool and let that woman help you save our home.' Because that is what Margaret is doing, Edith. She is helping me save the home that Emmeline and I built together, and I will not apologize for that." Edith left without another word. Caleb stood in the empty parlor for a long time, feeling the echo of what he had said. He had defended Margaret, not because she needed defending. She was more than capable of fighting her own battles, but because it was the truth. And the truth, once spoken, has a way of clearing the air. Margaret came back that evening with news that 2 of the breeding cows were pregnant. It was the first real sign that their plan was working. New calves meant growth, meant the herd would expand, meant the ranch had a future. She told him over dinner, her face showing more excitement than he had seen from her before. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks were flushed from the cold ride, and Caleb thought, not for the first time, but for the first time clearly, that she was beautiful. Not in the way that Emmeline had been beautiful, which was soft and warm and golden. Margaret's beauty was different. It was the beauty of a well-made tool, of a strong bridge, of something built to endure. It was in the way she carried herself, the way she looked at a problem and saw a solution, the way she could gentle a nervous cow with just her voice and her hands. "You are staring," Margaret said. "I was thinking," Caleb replied. "About what?" He looked at his plate. "About how the ranch is starting to feel like a ranch again." She studied him for a moment with those measuring brown eyes. "Yes," she said, "it is." November passed. December came with the first frost, painting the fields white in the mornings and turning the repaired barn into a warm, steaming sanctuary where the cattle huddled together. The mornings were so cold that the water in the trough had a thin skin of ice that Caleb had to break with a stick before the cattle could drink. Margaret had finally moved out of her wagon and into the spare room of the house, not because of any change in their arrangement, but because Caleb pointed out that sleeping in a wagon in December was impractical to the point of stupidity. "You have a way with words, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Caleb," he corrected her. "If you are living under my roof, you can use my name." "Caleb," she said, testing the word. It sounded different when she said it, warmer somehow, as if her voice added something to it that his own name had been missing. "Then you should call me Margaret." It was a small thing, a tiny shift in the distance between them. But small things are how the biggest changes begin. Living in the same house changed the texture of their days. The mornings now started with coffee together at the kitchen table, a quiet ritual that neither of them acknowledged but both relied on. Margaret would cook breakfast while Caleb split firewood. He would come in stamping the cold from his boots, his breath making clouds in the warm kitchen air. And there would be eggs and biscuits and sometimes bacon, if the supply held out, and they would eat together in the warm kitchen while the frost melted on the windows, and the house filled with the smell of food and wood smoke and coffee. The house itself seemed to change. For 2 years, it had been a place where Caleb slept and ate and existed, a shell with walls and a roof and nothing else. Now there were small touches everywhere. A jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that Margaret had collected in the fall, a clean cloth on the kitchen table, curtains that she had sewn from a bolt of fabric she had brought in her wagon. Nothing fancy, just a simple blue check pattern that let the light in and made the rooms feel softer. The house was waking up, like its owner. Caleb noticed these things one by one, the way you notice the sun getting warmer in early spring, not all at once, but gradually, until one day you realize that winter is over and you cannot remember exactly when it ended. The evenings were different too. Instead of sitting on the porch, which was now too cold for comfort, they sat by the fireplace in the front room. Margaret read books she had brought from Kansas, thick novels with small print that she devoured at a remarkable pace. She would fold herself into the armchair with her feet tucked under her and a blanket across her lap, and she would disappear into whatever world the pages offered. Sometimes she would read aloud a passage that struck her, and Caleb would listen and nod and pretend he understood the literary references, though most of the time he did not. Caleb whittled, a habit he had picked up from his father as a boy and never lost. He carved small animals and figures from scraps of wood, working with a pocket knife that had belonged to his grandfather. His hands, which were clumsy with most delicate things, became precise and patient when they held a piece of wood. He was better at it than he let on. One night, about 3 weeks after Margaret moved into the house, she looked up from her book and watched him carve for a while. The fire was crackling low, casting long shadows across the room. The wind outside was doing its December work, pushing against the walls and rattling the windows. "What is that one?" she asked. He held it up. It was a horse, small and detailed, caught mid-stride with its mane flying. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it. "Emmeline used to put them on the mantel," Caleb said. He nodded toward the shelf above the fireplace, where a row of small wooden animals still stood, dusty but intact. A deer, a rabbit, a dog that looked like the one they had owned, and in the center, a woman with her arms outstretched, reaching for something only she could see. Margaret got up and looked at them closely. She touched the little wooden woman very gently. "You made this?" "The year she died," Caleb said. "I could not sleep, so I carved." Margaret turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that he had not seen before. Not pity, something warmer and more dangerous than pity. "You loved her very much," she said. "I did. And you are afraid that caring for someone again means you love her less." The words hit him like a stone dropped into still water. He stared at her, his knife frozen mid-stroke. "I know," Margaret said softly, "because I feel the same way. Every time I enjoy a meal at this table, or laugh at something you say, or feel glad to see you walk through the door, there's a voice in my head that says, I am betraying William, that if I let myself feel something new, it means what we had was not enough." The fire crackled between them. The wooden animals watched from the mantel. "But I have been thinking about it," Margaret continued, her voice steady, even though her hands were not. "And I believe that William and Emmeline would both say the same thing. They would say that loving someone new does not erase the love that came before. It just means your heart is bigger than you thought it was." Caleb set the knife down. He looked at this woman who had arrived at his gate with a business proposal and a canvas bag, who had repaired his fences and saved his feed and cooked meals that made his empty house feel like a home again. This woman who spoke the truth the way other people breathed, naturally and without apology. "I am not good at this," he said. "At what?" "At saying what I feel. Emmeline always said I had the emotional vocabulary of a fence post." Margaret's lips twitched. "That is not untrue. But I want you to know," he said, and the words came slowly, pulled from somewhere deep, "that this ranch is not the only thing you saved. You saved me too. I was disappearing, Margaret, a little more each day, and then you showed up with your wagon and your cattle and your opinions, and I started coming back." She crossed the room and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She just sat there, warm and solid and real, and let the silence between them become something else. Something that felt like the beginning of a road neither of them had planned to walk, but both of them wanted to follow. Caleb reached over and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched since the handshake on the porch 3 months ago. Her hand was rough from work, her fingers strong and sure. He held it carefully, the way he held everything that mattered. "I would like to change the terms of our partnership," he said. "How so?" "I would like it to be permanent." Margaret looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. Her eyes were bright with something he recognized because he felt it too. The terrifying, extraordinary relief of not being alone anymore. "I would like that very much," she said. They sat by the fire for a long time that night, hands clasped, saying very little. Outside, the December wind moved across the valley, cold and clean. The cattle were quiet in the rebuilt barn. The wooden animals stood on the mantel, Emmeline's outstretched arms reaching toward the warmth of the fire. And on the porch, where Caleb had sat alone for 2 years, watching his world shrink, the chairs sat empty because the people who belonged in them were finally inside, together where the fire was. They married in January, on a clear, cold morning when the valley was white with frost and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. The ceremony was small, held in the little white church on the edge of town. Just the preacher and a handful of neighbors who had come to mean something to both of them. Tom Driscoll stood as Caleb's witness. Mrs. Driscoll stood as Margaret's. The preacher kept it short, which everyone appreciated because the church was not well heated and their breath made clouds in the cold air. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep green that she had been saving in the bottom of her trunk since Kansas. She had pressed it that morning with an iron heated on the stove. And when she walked into the church, the green of the dress against the white of the frost-covered windows made Caleb forget every word he had planned to say. He just stood there, looking at her, until the preacher gently cleared his throat and reminded him that there were vows to exchange. Caleb wore a clean shirt and the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck. His hands were shaking when he took Margaret's, and she squeezed them once, firm and sure, the same grip she had used on that first handshake on the porch. The gesture steadied him. It said, without words, "I am here. We are doing this. It is going to be fine." Old Joe Tanner was there, naturally, sitting in the second row with his wife, and he was heard to say, "Took them long enough." "Joseph," his wife warned, "I am celebrating. Woman, let me celebrate." After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the Driscoll house, with cake and coffee and a fiddle player who had ridden in from the next town. Caleb danced with Margaret for the first time, and he was terrible at it, just as he had been terrible when Emmeline first taught him. But Margaret laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and the sound of it filled the room like music that was better than anything the fiddle could produce. Even Edith Hartley came. She sat in the back row of the church and did not speak during the ceremony, her face set in the complicated expression of a woman fighting a battle between her grief and her decency. When the ceremony was over, She approached Margaret with a stiff back and an unreadable face. "My daughter loved that ranch," Edith said. "I know," Margaret replied gently. "In the garden she planned, in the way the house faces the mountains, in the blue paint on the shutters. She built something beautiful, Mrs. Hartley. I am not here to replace that. I am here to continue it." Something shifted in Edith's face. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a door cracking open just slightly, letting in a sliver of light. The blue shutters, Edith said, they need repainting. "I was planning to do that in the spring," Margaret said. Edith nodded once, sharply, as if confirming a business transaction. Then she turned and left, but at the door of the church she paused and looked back. Her eyes found Caleb, and in them he saw something he had not expected. Permission, not spoken, not acknowledged, but there. The permission of a mother who loved her daughter enough to let the man her daughter had loved find happiness again. Caleb watched her go and felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he had been carrying since the day he defended Margaret in the parlor. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was acceptance, the slow, grudging acceptance that life goes on and that the people we lose would want it to. Spring came early that year. As if the land was making up for the cruelty of the drought, the creek ran again, clear and fast, filling the pools and softening the banks until the water meadow below the house was green enough to make your eyes ache after months of brown and gray. The fields turned green almost overnight, a tide of new growth rolling across the valley like a promise being kept. And the cattle grew fat on new grass, their coats turning sleek and shiny in the warming sun. The 2 pregnant cows delivered healthy calves in March, strong little creatures that wobbled on their legs for about 10 minutes, and then ran as if they had been born knowing how. Margaret was there for both births, kneeling in the straw of the new barn at 3 in the morning, her sleeves rolled up and her voice low and steady. Caleb watched her guide the first calf into the world and felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought was permanently sealed shut. It was hope, plain and simple. The kind of hope that comes when you see new life where there used to be nothing. "Healthy and strong," Margaret said, wiping her hands on a cloth and looking up at him with a tired smile. "Both of them." "Both of them," Caleb repeated. And he was not talking about the calves. Margaret and Caleb worked the ranch together through that first spring, and the work that had once felt like penance now felt like purpose. There was a difference, Caleb realized, between working to survive and working to build. The first one wears you down. The second one fills you up. Every fence post he set, every row he plowed, every morning he woke up and put his boots on felt different now, because it was not just his ranch anymore. It was theirs. They expanded the herd through the summer, buying 4 more breeding cows from a rancher in the next valley who was selling out. Margaret negotiated the price, and Caleb learned quickly that she was better at that kind of thing than he was. She had a way of being pleasant and firm at the same time that left the other person feeling like they had gotten a fair deal, even when they had not gotten everything they wanted. It was a gift. They planted new fields, too, following Margaret's water plan. The diversion channel she had sketched in her notebook back in September was dug in April, a shallow trench along the east ridge that directed the spring runoff into the creek bed instead of letting it wash across the fields. The difference was immediate. The soil held its moisture longer. The grass grew thicker. By June, the east pasture looked better than it had in 5 years. William would be proud of that channel, Caleb said one evening, looking at the green field from the porch. Margaret looked at him, surprised. He had never mentioned William's name before. "Yes," she said softly, "he would be. I am glad you told me about him." Caleb said, "About the water and the engineering. It saved the east pasture." "He saved the east pasture," Margaret corrected gently. "Even gone, he found a way to help." Caleb nodded. He understood that. Emmeline was still helping too, in her own way. Every time he looked at the blue shutters, every time he swept the porch, every time he remembered the words she used to say, "This is where we belong," he felt her hand on his back, pushing him forward. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about the future, about adding a room to the house because the spare room was small, and Margaret's books were overflowing from the shelf Caleb had built and onto every flat surface in the house. About buying the adjacent parcel of land if it came up for sale, 40 more acres of good grazing ground that would double their capacity. About children, maybe, someday, if life was kind enough to offer them that. They talked about it the way people talk about things they want but are afraid to want too much, carefully, with pauses, leaving room for the other person to back away if they needed to. Neither of them backed away. On the first anniversary of Margaret's arrival, Caleb woke before dawn. The house was quiet. Margaret was still asleep in the room down the hall, and the first gray light of morning was just beginning to touch the windows. He went to his workbench in the corner of the kitchen, where his whittling tools were laid out in a neat row, and he picked up a piece of oak that he had been shaping for the past week. He worked for an hour, the knife moving in small, careful strokes, shaping the wood into the figure he had been seeing in his mind. When he was finished, he carried it to the mantel above the fireplace and placed it among the other wooden animals. It was a woman, strong and steady, standing beside a man. Their hands were clasped. Margaret found it when she came down for coffee. She stood in front of the mantel for a long time, looking at the little figure, her hand pressed to her heart. She did not say anything. She just looked at Caleb with those brown eyes that saw everything, and he saw that she understood. The old carving of Emmeline was still there, arms outstretched, and beside it, the new one. 2 different loves, 2 different women, standing together on the same shelf in the same home. There was room for both. There had always been room for both. That summer, Caleb took Margaret to the hill behind the house where Emmeline was buried. They stood together under the big oak tree, looking at the stone with its simple inscription. Margaret had brought wildflowers, columbine and Indian paintbrush from the creek bank. She laid them at the base of the stone without a word. "She would have liked you," Caleb said. "You keep saying that because it keeps being true." Margaret slipped her hand into his. "Thank you for sharing her with me," she said, "and thank you for letting me be here." They walked back to the house, hand in hand, the same way they walked everywhere now, together at the same pace, neither one pulling ahead or falling behind. The ranch spread out around them, green and alive, 40 acres that had almost died and come back stronger. like the people on it. The years that followed were good ones. Not easy because nothing on the frontier was ever easy, but good in the way that matters. Good in the way that fills a house with warmth and a life with meaning. There were hard winters when the snow piled up past the windowsills and they spent long nights in the barn, keeping the newborn calves alive. There were dry summers that made Caleb's stomach clench with the old fear, though they never again reached the cruelty of 1877. There were sick cattle and broken equipment, a fence that fell down 3 times in the same spot until Caleb finally admitted that the ground was wrong and moved it 10 feet south. There were arguments too, because 2 stubborn people living and working together will always find things to disagree about. Margaret wanted to invest in new breeding stock from Colorado. Caleb thought it was too expensive. Margaret won that argument, and the Colorado cattle turned out to be the best investment they ever made. Caleb wanted to dig a new well on the north side of the property. Margaret thought the water table was too deep. Caleb dug it anyway. He hit water at 40 feet and never let her forget it. But even their arguments had a quality of partnership to them. 2 people who respected each other enough to disagree honestly and cared about each other enough to find a way through. They never went to bed angry. That was Margaret's rule, borrowed from her mother, and Caleb honored it even on the nights when honoring it meant sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, talking through whatever the disagreement was until they found the place where their 2 opinions met. There were the 1,000 small joys that make up a life on the land, too. The first morning of every spring, when the meadowlarks came back and filled the valley with song, the smell of fresh-cut hay in August, the satisfaction of a fence built straight and a field plowed clean. Sunday mornings, when they would sit on the porch with coffee and watch the valley wake up, not talking, just being together in the quiet. But there were also mornings when the sun came up over the mountains and the valley was so beautiful it made your chest ache. There were evenings by the fire, reading and whittling and talking about everything and nothing. There were nights when Margaret would fall asleep with her book on her chest and Caleb would gently take it from her hands, mark her page, and cover her with a blanket, and she would murmur something in her sleep that sounded like his name. There were the first steps of their daughter, born in the spring of 1879, a girl with Margaret's steady eyes and Caleb's stubborn jaw. They named her Emmeline. Margaret suggested it, and the way she said it, quietly, over dinner one evening, with her hand resting on her belly, told Caleb everything he needed to know about the woman he had married. She understood that love is not a thing that gets used up. It grows, it makes room, and naming their daughter after the woman who had loved this land first was not an ending. It was a continuation. Caleb loved her even more for understanding why it mattered. Little Emmeline grew up on that ranch the way children should grow up, with dirt under her fingernails and sunlight on her face. She learned to ride before she could read, sitting in front of her father on his old bay horse, her small hands gripping the saddle horn, her laughter carrying across the fields. She learned to mend a fence before she could sew a dress, standing beside Margaret with a pair of pliers and a determined expression that was pure Caleb. She was equal parts both her parents, practical and tender, stubborn and kind. She had Margaret's way of looking at a problem and seeing a solution, and Caleb's way of working at something until it was done. no matter how long it took. She would sit on the porch in the evenings between Caleb and Margaret, listening to the coyotes call across the valley, her small body warm against Caleb's side, and she would say, "This is where we belong." The same words, passed down like a hymn from one generation to the next. And every time she said them, Caleb would look at Margaret over their daughter's head, and Margaret would look back, and in the space between their eyes was everything that mattered. Gratitude, love, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had found their way to each other through drought and loss and stubbornness, and that what they had built together was strong enough to last. By the time Caleb and Margaret had been married 10 years, the ranch had grown to 120 acres. The herd numbered over 100 head. The house had 2 new rooms, a proper kitchen, and blue shutters that Margaret repainted every spring. Old Joe Tanner had built them a new porch, wider than the first one, with room for 3 chairs and a view that stretched clear to the mountains. They never forgot what brought them together: the drought, the desperation, the handshake on a dusty porch between 2 people who had nothing left but what they could offer each other. They never forgot that the best things in their lives had come not from strength, but from surrender, from the willingness to admit that they could not do it alone. On warm evenings, when the work was done and the fire was burning low, Caleb would sometimes look at Margaret and feel a gratitude so deep it had no words, for the woman who had driven her wagon to his gate, for the hand she had extended, for the simple, extraordinary courage it took to say, "I would like to buy half your ranch," when what she really meant was, "I think we can save each other." And Margaret would look back at him with those steady brown eyes, and she would know exactly what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too, that some things in this life are worth more than gold or land or cattle, that the richest thing a person can own is someone who shows up when the world is falling apart and says, "I am staying." And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is burning low now, just embers and a soft orange glow. Some stories end with gunfights and courtroom dramas. This one ends with a handshake that turned into something neither of them expected. 2 people, 2 losses, 1 piece of land, and the stubborn, beautiful refusal to give up. That is the West I remember. Not the loud parts, the quiet ones. The ones where people find each other in the middle of nowhere and decide to stay. You rest easy tonight, friend. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.